Alrighty, sorry about that. Little technical issue there, but we're up and running. So, hello. Can everyone see that all right? It's a little dim.
Very dim.
So one more technical issue. Yeah.
There we go.
Still pretty dim.
There's buttons for those.
There's buttons for everything.
Show the share.
No, that is
To minus.
So switches over there.
Next to the fighting octopus.
Ah, here it is.
Close.
Ooh. Bunker time.
Alrighty. So this is Design and Agile Projects. My name is Sean Eddings. I'm a senior producer at Last Call Media. A little bit about me here to start. Like I said, I work at Last Call Media. We're a creative agency based in Northampton, Massachusetts. And one of the things that I do there is I run the agency's production efforts. So as a senior producer on the team, I'm largely responsible for establishing the project's overall purpose, the vision, and then working with stakeholders and essentially all parties involved to deliver on that vision. A little bit about Last Call. We like to say that we're a digital destination that helps organizations build tools and solutions to improve their communities. And one of the projects that we did most recently that I'm most proud of is for Rainforest Alliance. So this was a real test of our agility, true to who we are and why we do things. We helped this wonderful organization, this wonderful nonprofit, by delivering a powerful tool to help them with their year-end campaign. So this is also on Drupal 8. Which was a huge improvement for them on the back end. Inline contenting, a lot of those really awesome Drupal 8 features that people have been enjoying. Looks great across all breakpoints. And all of that is just to say that we've done some really great work for a lot of amazing organizations by focusing on understanding their vision. We've been fortunate enough, again, to retain these relationships over time. So kind of what we're here to talk about today is design and agile projects. So a lot of times these projects will start, and I just found out that if any of you were in Kelly's session earlier, you've probably seen a lot of these illustrations. They're multi-purpose, but essentially the first step, right, when you start a project, traditionally is to write a plan, kind of gain that initial alignment on what you're trying to do. You're both, looking at something, you're both evaluating it, you're trying to understand what it means. Right, there's nothing wrong with this, right? It's important to gain that initial momentum. The issue is, and that is usually a little bit easier to see, these plans can be fairly long and detailed from the very beginning, and they also have this thing that people like to say, the final version, right? Where this is, all the things we're going to do, here's a timeline, here's your Gantt chart, and this is the final version. Nothing can change, and you're going to get a signature on it, and you're going to store it away, and you're going to reference it from time to time, and it'll lead to some frustration later, which we'll talk about. The issue with that is that it's this old, a lot of times these plans follow this very old relay race mentality, where you have to finish one phase before you move to the next phase, before you move to development, before you move to testing, and then before if you even make it that far, when you said you were going to be there, you actually deliver something at the end. So another big thing here is that there's rigidity that builds in between each one of these phases. So as you're progressing, you can't move from one to the other. So then you have that moment where that big reveal comes, right? You've been working on something internally for a really long time. You're really excited about it. There's a lot of passion internally, a lot of excitement, and you reveal it. And you get feedback like, okay, but what about this thing that we talked about, 2 months ago, state-of-the-art human-computer interaction, right? I'm not too sure, but these are actually things that we've pulled from statements of work, and then a month later, we're reviewing it, and they're like, well, what about, where's the state-of-the-art human-computer interaction, right? Or we were looking for depth, right? A vibrant look to the page. And then you probably have a project manager or something like that who's now like, oh my, how did we get here? There's some burnout. We had this plan, we talked about this plan, it was great for the past 2 months. We had those weekly status calls where we talked about how great things were going. And it's because I think that traditional iron triangle, right, the scope, budget, and timeline, leaves very little for things like quality and fidelity in terms of the accuracy of what you're working on. So when this happens, when your project manager or whomever is on the sofa venting, fingers get pointed at the client, right, at who you're working with. They didn't really tell us that state-of-the-art human-computer interaction was that important to them. What does that even mean, right? So we figured out that rarely worked. We spent too much time putting together this really amazing, solid plan that always ended up changing, right? This created a tremendous amount of friction and noise and meant very little overall continuous flow. Flow is what I like to consider value delivered over time spent. So obviously you want to maximize that by delivering the maximum amount of value over the least amount of time spent. So this ratio wasn't really as high as we wanted it to be. So for the amount of time that we're spending, why are we not delivering more value, right? And then why does it seem to happen every single time? So then we go back to that fundamental question, why are we planning, right? So if we continue to plan and the plan never works, so maybe we should just abandon the idea of planning, right? Obviously, that's not the case. Planning initially, in the very beginning, when we're all kind of looking at something, is kind of to develop an initial awareness over what these forces are at play that are kind of going to dictate how this project will work. So an example of that could be scope, budget, and timeline. Another thing that's important to recognize are any internal company politics, any other dynamics, establishing those lines of communication, right? Because those forces work together somehow over time to shape the reality of what we're going to deliver together. And it's important. I like to call them forces because you can't really ignore them. It's kind of like gravity. You can't, you throw a ball up in the air and it doesn't come back down. You don't immediately start to think, well, maybe gravity isn't working today. It's gravity's always there, like budget, scope, and timeline. You just need to figure out how to work with those forces to deliver something at the end. So in a business, right, the forces that we come across from time to time are cash flow, capacity, and utilization, right? So how many people do we have available? How utilized are they? Are they over 100%, under 100%? So how do we work to balance those? So we have this scene from I Love Lucy. I'm not sure. Any I Love Lucy fans in here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So kind of sometimes like two people. In this scene, right, Lucy and Ethel are on the chocolate assembly line, and chocolates are coming out, and the capacity is they each have two hands, and their utilization is in the beginning probably about 60%, right? It's casual, very slow paced. And then all of a sudden, their boss is like, oh, look, you're doing such a great job. They just keep turning it up. And then all of a sudden, the utilization is 130%, right? And chocolate's going everywhere. And it kind of feels like a tremendous amount of feedback is being thrown at them, and they don't have those feedback loops that you need to sort of adjust kind of how things are going. So we've realized the answer to that fundamental question of why do we plan is that the value of the plan is in the time and energy that we spend planning. So this goes to things like communication, establishing those lines of communication, talking about what we're going to be working on together. And from there, we realized, okay, we were too linear and rigid. A little self-reflection in our overall initial process. There's always pressure to finish one phase before moving to the next. So we also learned things a little too late. By waiting and building up to these giant reveals, we weren't getting that feedback early and often to make sure that we were on the right course, to validate the decisions that we were making along the way. We also need to learn how to adapt quicker so that when we do realize that that an additional or a change in direction is appropriate, that it's easier, right? And it's faster, right? Because what we want to do is essentially increase value delivered over time spent to increase flow and reduce noise and friction, right? So we question again that traditional model of build, plan, deliver, that mantra that is ingrained in that waterfall methodology, where you plan a lot, then you move to the building phase, then you deliver something. Very few feedbacks in there, very few opportunities in there for feedback, right? So, and when we're building that initial plan, we're always very optimistic in terms of what we can do within the amount of time that we have. So it kind of turns into this: build, plan, build, wait, and deliver, right? So how about we challenge that and we switch it to inspect, adapt, and create, right? So agility allows us, or rather provides us with this opportunity to change that model a little bit. So let's stop doing everything we can to avoid planning, or stop doing everything we can to build a perfect plan, and instead figure out how to be flexible and adapt in the moment as we learn new things. So it kind of becomes this feedback loop where you inspect, adapt, create, inspect, adapt, create. So kind of how do we do that, right? So I think one of the things that is critical there is establishing lines of communication, right? Having a small multidisciplinary team that's empowered to make the right decisions, right? Opportunities to gain feedback regularly, maintaining alignment with all those involved, and then, a commitment to flexibility to adapt as things change. So I think that together allows us to inspect, adapt, and create, and deliver ultimately something at the end of the day that is the most valuable thing that it can be. So in terms of design, one of the things that we do, we found to be important here, is to communicate regularly and deliver often. So as an idea is building up its fidelity from a sketch on the back of a napkin to an idea in a stakeholder's head, as we're building it and gaining that momentum, it's important to communicate regularly on that progress there, daily, and definitely weekly, and by showing something, right? Because great ideas can be fragile and need some friends. So the way that we can do that is by showing that these great ideas are headed in the right direction.
Can I just so I like the idea of the inspect, adapt, create. I just can you go what are we what's the inspect part like?
Yeah.
Versus difference between the plan, build, release.
Yep. That's an excellent question. Do you mind if we circle back to it at the end?
Sure.
Yeah.
I just
Excellent question, though.
on that,
Very good question.
exactly.
So great ideas can be fragile and need a lot of friends. So the way that these ideas can build these friendships is by showing momentum on their progress. Creativity is a multidisciplinary team sport. So one of the things that's important there is having all the team members that are involved in the project from the beginning. So that's your strategy folks, your design folks, your development team, and the producer and any sort of management team. Getting feedback. So ideas don't have to be perfect before you ask for feedback. So a lot of the times we can use different tools that we have available to us, like a magnifying glass, glasses, microscope, goggles, right? Even a banana, whatever it takes to essentially put something in front of someone and ask them, to essentially provide feedback on it. Like, are we in the right direction? Is this headed kind of toward that vision that we've been talking about this whole time, right? Because to validate that we're on the right path. Seek alignment over following the plan. So this is kind of like an art, right? Because it can be very tricky, especially in the very beginning in the creative phase, where you have all these ideas and you're juggling all these ideas, and one of them may even be something detrimental like a bomb, and you're trying to manage that and not have it explode and cause delays and whatnot, and be a distraction essentially to the team. Through all that, we can then work together to establish that shared reality. So by communicating and having that understanding of what we're doing, and we'll have that shared reality that we can use to gain that alignment and maintain that alignment. So we all know what this means. So now we know. Now we want to figure out, are we on the right path? And then maintaining that flexibility to adapt as new things are discovered, to then ultimately continuously deliver the right things. So to think about this in a diagram, it's very similar to like a lean UX model, right? We want to start by thinking about an idea, right? What about this idea do we know, and what is enough to move it into the make phase, right? That could be something like a sketch on the back of a napkin. That can be on a chalkboard. That can be pretty much anything just to move the idea forward. Then we want to check that idea, right? We've done something. We want to ask about it. We want to get feedback on that idea. Perhaps depending on where we are, we may even want to introduce some things like user testing, expand the amount of people that are involved in this idea, right? Because as the idea is increasing in fidelity, it becomes a stronger idea and ready for more opinions. And then, of course, this can turn into things like prototyping. And then from prototyping, you may even start introducing a development or a Drupal installation or whatever you're working on to start building the idea. So instead of the horizontal slicing, we have vertical slicing. So we're working on almost all these things at the same time. And that means that we have smaller releases, right? Incremental releases, rather than those giant, big releases that are traditional to the waterfall model. So a couple examples here from projects that we've worked on in the past where we've leveraged this mentality is for IDG, International Data Group out in Framingham. We helped them reimagine the CC exchange. So the initial problem statement here was they wanted to build a social network for CIOs. Essentially, CIOs belong to this group and they wanted to maintain a private social network for them so that they could exchange ideas, network, and build their own private relationships. So during discovery, one of the things that we found out was that there was already a solution for that. If CIOs wanted to do that, they could go to LinkedIn. So perhaps maybe we shouldn't rebuild LinkedIn, and instead let's focus on the thing that they were really trying to do, which was leverage their services. Right, their business model was, essentially creating a community for CIOs, and then creating these, and then encouraging those CIOs to take advantage of their services, like executive coaching and other CIO-like services. So the idea there was, you've built it, kind of some have come. It wasn't really that popular with CIOs because they already had all these other networks that they belonged to. So it's time to engage them and encourage them to stick around. So the agreement was signed. We began that discovery phase. We had that big realization, right? So that was after the plan, which had set forth in motion, had put forth this idea of rebuilding this social network for CIOs. And one of the first things we realized was that's actually not at all what we're going to do. So through a few planning sessions, right, the idea kind of started to take shape where perhaps instead of this social network, we could build this portal for CIOs to access and interact with meaningful content to them based on their subscription, and interact with other services as necessary that may be appropriate to them and their role. So this was turned around in just a few days, right? So once we realized that we needed to adapt and pivot, we turned this around in a few days.
This is what? A wireframe?
This is a wireframe, yeah. So it kind of came out of this at the bottom right, this is a colleague's notebook. So he was in this meeting listening to one of the stakeholders who said that I think she said she wanted it to look like Pinterest, with the card layout and all the different cards that can be presented there. So we turned this around quickly in just a few days, right? We took something out of a notebook and put it into a wireframe like this, and we kind of had enough alignment here from the stakeholders that we were able to move into development and start thinking about things like fields and functionality on each field, and how we're going to begin structuring this content. Perhaps if we were in this stage and we didn't have the alignment that enough alignment to do something like take an immediate leap into development, we may have done some more content modeling, or a few other things to help kind of illustrate that we are building this idea and it's the right idea, or to help adapt and get other feedback before we moved into something that could potentially be as permanent as development. But the alignment there was so strong that we moved right to development, started mapping out fields. I think development started before we had finalized design. So creative was still working. We had enough alignment to understand, like I said, the fields and the content types and the overall content structure. And we were really just finessing at that point the overall presentation strategy, things like fonts and colors. And it came out amazing, I think. So instead of heading down that path that we thought we would be on from the very beginning, we pivoted and instead built a more services-oriented platform for CIOs to engage with meaningful content based on their subscription. And of course, looks great across all breakpoints because that's what you have to do. And I think one of the strengths here was that the entire team was involved in this from the very start to the end of the project. So that meant that the creative team, the strategy team, the design team, and development were pretty much all working together. So as creative had an idea about something, I think the menu animation there is, and before creative sort of reached out and presented that idea, they wanted to run it by development. Development said, yeah, that looks great. So they got that quick, by communicating internally, they got that quick validation that this is something that can be completed within those constraints, within those forces that we were talking about earlier. Another one was for a project for a school in Northern Virginia, Randolph-Macon Academy. So we started off with that very traditional waterfall model where we're going to begin this project with content strategy, and we're going to move from there to wireframes, and we're going to get validation on every single one of these, and then we're going to move into designs or style tiles to sort of get verification that we're on the right path with colors. So each one of these phases took several weeks. And we presented them with essentially 3 options to pick from, which would then, once they approved one of these options, we'd apply this aesthetic to the wireframes that had already been approved. So we did that. They picked this one, and we delivered it. And we were expecting at the time quick sign off, right? Because we've been talking about this the whole time. So this is essentially the style tile that you picked. This is what it's going to look like. And the feedback was, oh, well, this looks great, thank you. And then all of a sudden the next day we got a surprise, right? So despite our best efforts, right, there was a stakeholder involved who had not been participating throughout the entire time and said, oh no, this is absolutely too dark, right? This isn't going to work. So at that moment, right, the traditional model, which we quickly abandoned, would have been to go back to the plan and to say something like, okay, well, you every step of the way here, you approved all these artifacts. So now we have to redo the plan. And that'll take, I guess, a week, maybe a week and a half. And then from there, we'll have a revised timeline for you for your new style tiles. And then you can pick one and we'll apply it to design. And then perhaps we'll be back here again. So the key is we didn't do that. We instead engaged in a series of in-depth conversations with them about what it is exactly they didn't like about the colors. And we found that it was really quite simple. They just didn't like how dark it was. So the black here on the sides is not part of the design. It's just we replaced the black at the top with a gold and changed the nav bar to their navy blue. And we really opened up the design, made it a lot brighter, a lot more colorful. And within, I think this took 2 days to pivot, we had tremendous alignment from all stakeholders involved. And then the other one, another challenge that we had to solve on this project was this idea of a viewbook. So traditional viewbooks on education sites are, you navigate to a viewbook and it presents itself as a PDF that you download. There are other more interactive type of viewbooks, but if you think about and technology and what platform or tools out there you could leverage, there are several. And while development had poked around with a few, we hadn't really been on the hook yet for delivering a viewbook essentially with any one of these tools. So the next move there came from a quote from Stephen Gates, who's the head of design at Citibank. And he gave this talk that the creative team thought was really powerful. And one of the things that he said is the spark of inspiration to the realities of execution, right? So the only way that we were going to get this viewbook done isn't if we did the wireframes, the designs, and then handed it off to development, and then development was on the hook for something with whatever time and budget was left. So development and the creative team kind of sat in the room, and this is just 2 people. So this was a developer and our art director kind of sat next to each other And the art director had a few different ideas for how he wanted to present this. And development had a few different ideas for how this could be implemented. And together, they sat next to each other pretty much for a week and rolled out this pretty interactive viewbook where there are right and left toggle buttons, and there's a menu at the top so you can jump between different sections of the viewbook. The elements are interactive. So there's a presentation, essentially a presentation tool that you can use to build presentations online. And we leverage that tool to essentially embed a presentation into a website. So it was one of those ideas that I've been kicking around. We weren't sure if it was something that would be able to get done, and it only took a week. And by showing that to them, they were stoked. So we got a high five. Cool. That was a lot faster. I'll come back to your question. So your question was plan, build, deliver. What's the difference between that and inspect?
Well, specifically, I mean, I think it's really obvious that the inspect, adapt, create. You know, like when you're starting from ground zero, it's not necessarily obvious what you're inspecting or adapting. And I guess you could go with like you're examining that you're inspecting the state and you have nothing, and you're adapting the resource that you have to make it that into something. I guess that's an accurate.
Definitely one way to.
Because, yeah. The rest is is all predicated on the idea. Like I have a thing that I'm then changing and iterating on repeatedly, but the ground state is kind of nebulous, I think.
Yeah, so an example there could be the CEC story, right, where we kind of started off with a blank slate.
Yep.
So one of the first things that we did was just by talking about things and conducting those interviews with stakeholders, that led to a very low fidelity sketch, right? And from there, we're able to inspect that sketch together, essentially. You know, where do we go from here? What's the most appropriate next step to build the fidelity of this idea into something that will eventually be built into a website, and then create. Oh boy, yeah. Yeah.
So I don't have this clearly thought out in my head. There's no way I'll articulate it fully, but what I want to ask about Agile design and the process is, for some of these examples, there's clearly like an initial vision, not of the final product, but of the brief. Like, what's our goal? Like, the school wants a website that current families love, and they're more likely to get new applications for people with that school.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the overall brief. And what I'm wondering is, in sort of the iterative process, and you did mention like alignment and sometimes having to pivot, in the process where we looked at like the circular pattern of making and then inspecting and reviewing and so on.
Yeah.
Is there in the process also something where there's a check against the vision and like, okay, within this process, this particular strategy we've chosen, like when are we reflecting, okay, do these new design choices, continue to work towards like that initial brief? And when does something actually get to the point you bubble it up and say, you know what, maybe they should pivot like in the vision, or maybe this idea just isn't really pursuing that vision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think as we think about things, right, so on the IDG example, we were called in and it was essentially to help rebuild that social network. So by discussing that with them, by talking to their stakeholders, and then also evaluating kind of their audience, we were able to, in the thinking stage kind of here, able to present information to help, persuade the stakeholder team, hey, look, this isn't really something that should be done, right? By bringing our own experience into the conversation and combining that with kind of the vision for the project, and by persuasion and bringing in data and examples from their users, we were able to pivot pretty quickly. But I guess perhaps more to your point, if we didn't do that and we're going to build a social network without any sort of external influence or any sort of external validation, right? It's going to be true to the vision, right? But then we have that conflict there where it may be true to that stakeholder's vision, but is this something that really makes sense to do at the end of the day, or can we kind of help this conversation and pivot it to be something that's even more useful? So I think that is something that happens in a more thinking stage, in the more abstract stage. A lot of times we get called into conversations where there's an overall business problem. So the business problem there was that the network itself, or this platform, CIOs were not engaging with it. So that problem statement there was, well, that we need to increase the engagement with those CIOs, and the stakeholders' vision was to redo it as a social network. But we were, and in validating that vision, we were able to figure out that perhaps wouldn't be the right next move.
That makes a lot of sense. I end up in so many meetings and conversations where at a certain point, the most salient question is what are we doing here?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I love thinking about these and seeing these charts and these processes, and I continually think to myself, does there need to be, it's so implicit, the goal, but when we break out how we do these processes, on top of this diagram, not literally, but in terms of these diagrams, on the top, does there need to be this is our vision,
right?
And as part of this iterative process, we all do it,
yeah.
But I'm wondering, does it or should it be spelled out? Here's where we're checking against. Not to make the process boring and awful, but just seeing that's what spurred the thought. Is there something that's so implicit that it's not spelled out on this diagram?
Right.
Which is we're iterating on this process, but where in that are we checking back on? Is it delivering the ultimate value that is?
Yep. Yeah. So this is an exercise that doesn't take weeks, right? Sometimes I could be in one of those meetings and we could go through this 9 times, right? As every idea comes up, let's sketch it, right? Let's think it through a little bit. Let's check it against what we're trying to do here and either throw it out or, refine it and continue the refinement on this idea. So this is, one thing that's important to make clear is this is definitely something that can happen, in my own thoughts within, a couple seconds, perhaps, as I think something through, or, perhaps if you need additional team members to build a wireframe or throw some colors on a wireframe, then it may take a little longer.
What are your go-to Agile planning tools? I'm guessing Microsoft Project is off the table.
Yes, that's a good guess. I won't make any comments there, just in case there are any Microsoft Project fans in the room. I guess that in itself was a comment.
Just general CPM.
Yeah.
What are your go-to tools?
So it really goes back to the we don't have go-to tools because and that may be a little alarming because we're constantly evaluating that. But one of the things that's important to me as a producer that I found to be successful is by understanding best the needs of who I'm trying to communicate with, and then figuring out, if we use Redmine, for example, and I'm trying to get a stakeholder in Redmine, and the stakeholder's I don't ever want to go into Redmine, then that's a risk, right? Because I won't get that information from them. So if they want me to stop by their office once a week to talk about it, then that's what I'm going to do. Whatever I can do to get to communicate with them as efficiently and quickly as possible to confirm that we're on the right path. We have several different tools we could talk about, but sorry. Yeah.
Does there come a point, or what is the point where you freeze it and say, this is our design, this is our estimate of the cost, and this is our timeline?
Mm-hmm.
And after that, any kind of scope changes will require some kind of a change order, or is it just available for change all through the project?
Yeah, so one of the things we didn't get into, but is a very important question, is making sure that we're working within those forces, right? So that takes a constant communication and being able to work internally to make sure that, like on that RMA example, we hadn't really worked with this tool before, but we knew there was a budget for it, and that was the budget. So what can we do to deliver the most value within that budget? So that took, sharing all those, the budget, timeline, and what the overall vision was with the team, and then making them aware of it and asking them how it would be possible. And then from there, essentially, we'll do, especially in the creative projects, we'll do some backlog grooming, where the functionality from designs development should already be aware of it because they're all kind of working together, so they sort of know that it's incoming. So any sort of major things, they'd kind of already call out. So we already pretty much know, based on the direction that the project's heading before it hits development, whether or not it's going to be something that may require a change order or an increase in budget. And by, so essentially, to answer your question, I think we do everything we possibly can to avoid those situations.
So the client knows they may end up being more than they originally signed up for because of their own preferences, or because of unexpected delays or great ideas that appear a little bit too late to get into the plan.
Yeah, so I mean, great ideas can happen at any time. So then it would just take a conversation about, hey, what do we have this great idea. I think it's a really great idea. Here's kind of what we have outstanding. Where does this great idea fall on the list of things that are really important? Is it the most important thing now that's the new greatest idea? That's kind of where I think the role of the producer comes in, is I want to make sure that, hey, look, this is a great idea. Let's not let this most amazing, greatest idea disrupt and destroy kind of all this progress and momentum that we've built. When this is something that could very well be an iteration or a second iteration or a third iteration, or this is something that would probably benefit from real-world user feedback that we could then capture and refine the idea.
What is the role that celebration plays in this process? Like, I find that in order to keep the morale of the team, it's really important to actually celebrate what's gotten done.
Yep.
How does that play a role in Agile?
Great. So in the creative process, or even in development process, by delivering regularly, we try to do at least once every 2 weeks, no longer than that, ideally more frequently, if we can, on a daily basis or a few times a week, with the team and the client team. So one of the things that's been incredibly validating to this process is by showing the client team the work of the team on a regular basis, we get their almost instant gratification, and the team can hear that. So I think that kind of touches on your question. So we'll release every 2 weeks essentially, and we'll walk through everything. And I like to bring in the team member who kind of did that piece to kind of walk through their thinking, and then they can hear directly from the client essentially what their thoughts are on it. But that also does take respect and a healthy client relationship, right? Because you won't, you have a team that has a lot of pride in their work. If you have a stakeholder who's really enjoys being negative and dismissive, that totally ruins any sort of celebration and excitement.
So what do you do about that?
Yeah, so
Do you celebrate separately? I mean, like.
So like in the event that we do have that stakeholder who likes to say no and naysay, well, so then that would be I would approach that differently. Depending on the dynamics, right, of why that stakeholder feels that way. And that was mostly just a joke, but I don't want to understand that, and then make sure that the team is shielded from that, right? Because I don't want that stakeholder to derail the team in any sort of way. So in that event, then it may just be me who's presenting this information with a resource as necessary. But yeah, we also have retrospectives at the end of every review where we get to walk through the work, how we did, in the spirit of continuous improvement, to talk about things, how that work went, how the team's feeling about it, and the client's feedback on that work. Then, maybe at the end of each major release or something like that, we may go to bowling or something, I don't know. Or where do we go? We go to the place in Hadley with the video games. Quarters.
How does this differ from spiral development?
Spiral development. So I'm not familiar with that one.
It was the next phase after waterfall.
Brief.
Basically,
Is that like going around the drain?
yeah, actually, going around the drain, or going up.
I guess spiraling upward is a way to.
Starting small, on each cycle you add more.
Okay, all right. Very good. Yeah, so I guess you're just each.
And this seems to be just a refinement of that.
Yeah, that's great. I've never heard of that. I'll look into it. Yes.
How do you figure out the budget? Do you have like a discovery phase and then you reassess?
Yeah.
Or how do you look at the budget?
Yeah, so a couple different ways to approach budgeting, because it's very important to have those conversations in the very beginning. If it's an existing relationship, right, there's almost always that initial trust, so we can have those conversations where, hey, let's be a little flexible. We can be flexible in the beginning for us to sort of understand kind of what this new big project will look like, and deliver estimates that way. But sometimes for new relationships, people have to protect themselves in the event where there are those surprises. So what we like to do, if it's an idea that starts from scratch, right, we bring our own experience and understanding. Okay, well, based on our initial conversations, perhaps in the sales cycle or in the very beginning, we understand this is most likely a more marketing-focused site, probably won't have that many integrations versus something like a web application that's going to be far more advanced. So based on the level of complexity, we can safely budget ranges based on our own experience, and then through the commitment on their end, how many stakeholders do they have, what's their availability look like, how involved do they want to be. Sometimes they have their own development resources and they want their development resources to be involved. Sometimes, we can be flexible there. Leslie.
So when you're creating your backlog,
Mhm.
and then you're grooming it later, how detailed do you get in the backlog? Because it is Agile, things are going to change. So when you're creating that initial backlog, is it just the high level, these are the 5 major things we want, or you're getting into a lot of detail so you can budget it better?
Yeah, I mean, we do like user stories. A healthy backlog will have, the high-level features that we're working toward, the prioritization of those features, and supporting user stories so that the team understands what it means for each one of these user stories to be done, and therefore that the testing and QA team can then also validate that that work was done to help kind of limit the work in progress.
But you're not getting into details until you actually put that into a sprint, that high-level idea?
When the high-level idea will kind of follow the project all the way through, right?
The details don't get added in until you're actually working on it?
Yeah, so perhaps the exact user stories of how user logs in may not come until later on. Yeah. Or sometimes, right, you'll have that user story for how users should log in, and it sounded great, and then in that planning meeting, you'll talk about it again, and you'll actually want to change it, and then we can be flexible and change it then.
That just made me think of where does QA fall in this? That seems like they would be part of. That would be part of what you're doing the entire cycle.
Yep.
Through, so that would reduce a lot of spend time, doing QA testing.
Absolutely. So we don't. We do all the formal QA testing, and that is part of each iteration. So we have pivoted away from those lengthy 2-month-long final QA.
You don't use the word alpha beta.
Right. Exactly. So more to feedback is reported as the work is delivered, and then incorporated into the next sprint. And then there are things like load testing and launch things that we have to keep in mind. But for the most part,
and that's what creative does, or is that more in the development?
Well, actually, creative is very much involved in QA. So in a project where we do have a design component that was from our team, they'll be involved in every Friday the review. They'll be there talking about, this is kind of what we've been talking about this whole time. And then they'll also give, pixel perfect feedback sometimes on line heights and stuff like that.
Do you have a formalized way of capturing knowledge and data from projects to inform future projects? Like how long certain kinds of things take,
Yep.
or things that get in the way. So.
Yep. So right. So we've got a lot of experience that we have gained a lot over the years, right? But that ends up being in the heads of certain people. So through retrospectives, I think like we touched on, where the team can kind of share that experience. We're spreading that knowledge from perhaps one person's head to 6 or 7 heads. And then from there, we have a tool that we like to use. We will, for time tracking and stuff like that, we'll use something like Harvest. And then we have our own Drupal 8 installation for internal project records, so that as critical moments come up, critical learning opportunities, we can record those so that the team moving forward can help support it, but then also we have that historical record. And that's something that we built internally.
What's the name again of that knowledge base utility that you?
Oh, so knowledge can come in obviously various shapes and sizes. So there's like knowledge as to how long did it take us to make that Viewbook, right? So the most valuable way to understand that would be through time logging. So for that, we would have something like Harvest. But then there's something like we used this tool to build that Viewbook, and that's how. And this is how that experience went. And we have our own. When we were exploring tools, we couldn't really decide on one particular tool. There are many strengths and weaknesses to each one. So we ended up thinking, okay, well, all we really want is fields on a content type, right? So we're just going to build our own Drupal 8 site for that. So, and that's been an interesting experiment because as we get feedback on that and figure out what the team really wants, that'll help inform whether or not we keep our own tool or perhaps explore one in the market. This guy.
I just want to make an announcement that, and I said this in the opening remarks, but the session at the end of the day, being agile about agile and digital agencies, I think would be awesome to, I don't know if Sean's available for that, but I'll be there and I'll get the other presenters from the other agile presentations to come and we can have a discussion about a lot of the stuff. I think the questions are really hinting at some really good things like, you know, agile contracts and then definitions of done and requirements and really have a conversation with all that stuff. So it wouldn't always, so when people are having a lot of questions and they're really great questions, and I think the answers need to be in the context of what the presentation was about, but I think a discussion at the end of the day would be really awesome. So that's, I think, in room 221 at the 4 or 5 o'clock slot. What was it, 4 o'clock? Yeah, 4 o'clock.
4 o'clock slot.
Yeah.
Cool. And I think it's lunchtime.